Well, I really love title guarantee events. I am a junkie. And I was just, before we got started today, visiting with people from all over Iowa that share my addiction to these kind of events. And it's an opportunity for us to gather with lenders and realtors and attorneys and abstractors and closers all over Iowa get together. And so it's a great opportunity for us to spend some time. And 3 hours, though, on closings. This is a long time. And my kids are nervous about this. Not so much for me. They're nervous for you. 3 hours on what? So I want to tell you a little story. And this is a little bit embarrassing, so don't tell anyone, okay? This is our secret. A couple months ago, I was handling a real estate closing, and about halfway through, this fellow says to me, "Don't you get bored with doing real estate closings?" And I didn't know how to respond to that. And I had one of these matrix moments. So sort of time stopped and I had a little conversation with myself. I thought, I don't know how to answer this question. If I say, yes, I'm bored with these things, then he wonders, why am I doing this? If I say, no, I don't get bored with this, then I'm like a schmuck. So I didn't know what to say. So I mumbled some kind of, well, I hope I bring some kind of value to the process, and moved on. But I left the meeting somewhat discouraged, and I called my wife. I said, "You'll never believe what this rude guy said in the closing." And I thought to myself, should I be bored with this? Should I be tired of this? I mean, I've been doing this about 17 years. And at some point, maybe I get tired of doing this. And so in some ways, the conversation was a good reminder of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I hope today that we're going to talk a lot of details about the mechanics of doing real estate closings. But I hope, in addition to the mechanics, there's also a lot of discussion about why we do what we do and the passion for doing things in the right way. We have 4 main points that we take into account when we sit down to do a closing. The first is we think about the lender. They hired us for a reason, and that reason is to make sure that we disperse the funds according to the settlement statement, and we make sure their mortgage is in first position. That's why we're there. It's not for our good looks. It's there because we're charged with making sure that those funds and mortgage are properly handled. That's rule number 1. We also have an eye to the borrower. We want to make sure that we present these documents in a way to the borrower so that when they leave the office, they have some sense of what they just went through. We'll talk about today. Thank you, Linda. The third audience we have, this is a bit metaphysical, and as we think about the quality of title in Iowa. I'm very pleased to say that Iowa has the cleanest title of any state in the country. I'm very proud of that. And our goal, what we have happen when a real estate closing takes place, coming up with a piece of real estate, that's an opportunity for us to make sure that we clear the title of any issues that are affecting that real estate. And so we want to make sure that we don't leave any garbage behind that title when it moves on from us. And the fourth goal that we have is we want to handle things in an ethical manner. We'll talk a lot about ethics today. The goal isn't just to get the box checked, but do things in a way that doesn't just get the job done, but actually promotes ethics here in Iowa. And we'll talk a lot about that today. So as we move into the presentation part, a little word about questions. So you are free to ask questions, particularly if I know the answers. If you have questions that I don't know the answers to, save those for the break, okay? I will be repeating your question, even though it's quite obvious to you that it's clear and understandable and simple, but the people who are watching this on video won't have a clue to why I'm giving a particular answer if I don't repeat that question. So if it seems a little stilted, I'm repeating your question, that's why I'm doing that. So let's start with the pre-closing phase of the transaction. We're not going to talk a lot today, much at all, about the title commitment process. I gave a presentation last fall, and that's available on the website for those who are interested more in the introduction to title examination. But I do want to give a little bit of word if you're a closer. Spend some time with those attorneys who are doing your title work and ask them to help you make sure that you know what issues are important when that title work comes your way. Now, some lawyers, unfortunately, have bypassed the process of using the title opinion. They go just to the title commitment. I think that's unfortunate because the title opinion provides us an opportunity to go deeper and explain things for the lenders and realtors who are using this title work. So we end up in our office doing both, the title opinion and the title commitment. So what I do when I have a title opinion, it's got some issues. Let's say it's got a child support judgment that needs to be addressed. What I do is I put a note in the email that I send, pay attention, there's a child support issue. And I'm trying to sort of go the extra mile to alert the realtors and lenders, don't just bypass this and throw this in the file. Pay attention, there's a title issue that's going to need your attention. For my own internal staff, I put a post-it note on that title opinion just to double check and make sure that they're paying attention. Hey, there is an issue that's going to require an extra measure of care. So as a closing agent, we want to avoid the, uh-oh, I didn't know about this. So ask your attorneys who are providing you title work to give you that extra heads up if there are title issues that require some attention. Now, as a reminder to those of you who are attorneys in the room, when you have a title objection, bear in mind your audience needs some guidance. For a lot of the objections you're going to be raising, people will know how to address X, Y, or Z. But if you have an objection that requires a little more involvement, then take your time to explain that so that people actually understand it. There's enough information about that objection that people can actually take steps to remedy it. I still see title opinions come my way, and it'll say, enter number 47 reports a judgment that must be addressed. Well, thank you very much for the information. Give us some more background. Tell us about this judgment. Who are the parties? Who are the case numbers? Give us some more information so we can take some kind of remedial measure. So that's an important thing about the title work. Now, very important part, we want to gather information. So we want to make sure, first of all, who are all the players? Sometimes we work with lenders, and there are so many different players in that lender, we don't know who to work with. So we're very intentional about saying to lenders, look, give us one person who we're going to work with that's going to be our liaison that we need to get approval from. It's very frustrating not to know who to get sign-offs on. We want to make sure we're gathering all of the closing figures from the buyers and the sellers. Now, here's something I want you to highlight in your material. Every number on the settlement statement has to have documentation in the file. Every single number. I want you to work under a presumption for every file that, number one, you're going to be sued over this file. Right? If you just sort of have that mentality that you're going to be sued over every file, that's going to affect the way in which you document issues that come up in the course of that closing, won't it? The other thing to presume is that you're not going to remember anything about this closing. As intense, as much time as you spend on that closing, on today's date, 6 months from now, you're not going to remember it. You just won't. And so document the files as if you're going to be sued and as if you're not going to remember how particular issues were addressed. I've given you a list of the things in your outline of the things that should be in your file. I want to also note, again, important emails. If there are some back and forth issues that were involved, keep copies of those in your file. I like getting a proposed deed. That way we can double check the legal, double check how vesting is going to take place. Purchase agreement and any amendments. I still have realtors who don't understand the importance of making sure that as a closing agent, I have amendments to the purchase agreement. And every amendment to that purchase agreement is just as important as the purchase agreement itself. It's the whole thing. So I have to have everything. You also want to make sure you have a copy of the title opinion or title commitment in that file. Now, a little heads up on this. Sometimes I do a transaction where the borrower has a fourth cousin who is a lawyer on the other side of the state, and every 6 years there's a title opinion. And he or she wants to do the title opinion in this transaction. That's fine. I'm fine with having someone else do the title work as long as they're a member of title guarantee. Because you can't get a title policy for an opinion that's not provided by an attorney that's a member of title guarantee. And a couple of occasions I've had to re-examine the abstract, issue a title opinion because I wasn't paying attention. The attorney was not a member of title guarantee. Now, we have a practice that we put in place 5 or 6 years ago where on Thursdays we pull the next week's files. Right? And the reason why we do that is we want to make sure that there aren't any issues in the coming week's closings that we haven't addressed. So we pull the files again and we look through, have we addressed all the title issues? Are there any factors like, for example, there's a reload company or there's a foreclosure, and there's some extra efforts that are going to be required to address those particular parties. And so pulling those files on Thursday is a very good practice to help us do that. We're also looking for open-end mortgages. An extra double check to make sure that we've taken steps to make sure that that open-end mortgage is going to be properly released. For sale by owners. Don't we just love for sale by owners? I hear the groans. For sale by owners are a drag. But I want to take you for a moment into the position of the for sale by owner party. They're in a situation where they're nervous. They're selling that house. They've done it on their own, but they don't know how this part works. They're in the process of moving. And so they've got the family all bundled up. They got the 5 cats. Everything is all loaded. And they're having to work with you as they move across the country. And so there are a lot of logistics that they have to work through. And you have their money. And that money is needed for that next transaction. That's a lot of issues to be on their plate. So it's understandable that they might have some defensiveness, some nervousness as they approach working with you. So what we've done is we put together, and turn over to page 19, and we put together a punch list that has been very helpful in working with the for sale by owner seller. And feel free to just take this stuff. It's why it's here. So we give them a punch list of those things that they need to provide and a sense of the time frame in which they need to provide those things. All right? So just a couple things to highlight. Item number 6, payoff statement from each mortgage holder. It is easier for that seller to get the payoff than anybody else. Now, if they want to have us get the payoff and we have authorization, we can do that. But it's very difficult. Lenders don't like it when I call them and say, hey, I don't have any relationship with John Doe, but can I have the payoff for his loan? They might have some understandable reservations about that. And so we want to help them understand they need to get us a proper payoff. We'll talk about payoffs in a moment in a little more detail. Instructions about what to do with the proceeds. Are we going to deposit those proceeds for them? Are they going to pick up the check when they come in to sign the settlement statement? Are we going to wire transfer those funds to an account somewhere? And then we have to talk about how we're going to deal with the settlement statement. We need them to review that draft settlement statement at least 24 hours in advance of the closing. And sometimes that's difficult. Maybe they're on the road somewhere. We've had situations where we've had to fax a draft settlement statement to a Staples in Cincinnati. They know they're going to be in Cincinnati. That's fine. We'll fax it to you there. You look it over. Great. It's gotten a lot easier now with smartphones and tablets and things. We can email. They can pull those documents up. So that part's gotten a lot easier. And then we need to have expectations about the day of the closing. We need to make sure that they're ready and able to sign that final settlement statement the day of the closing. So what I have found is that if we can have that conversation early on with the for sale by owner clients, life gets a lot easier. Okay? Questions on the settlement statement, or the dealing with for sale by owners? Okay. Preparing the settlement statement. Now today I'm going to try really hard not to talk about this as the HUD-1, because the HUD-1 that we dearly love is going away. And this is going to be replaced as a result of the regulations in Dodd-Frank. And so for future people watching this, eventually they may not know what a HUD-1 is. So we're going to refer to this today as the settlement statement. So the major task of this part of the phase is making sure that we're taking that information and importing it properly on the settlement statement. Now a little practice pointer on this: when you're preparing this, you're going to be using a computer program to do this. It's very easy to get distracted. You're sitting there preparing a settlement statement, you've got a couple phone calls going at the same time, and you miss something. So what we do is, as we import the number, we type in the number, we check it off on the instructions from the lender to make sure that we've put that number on the settlement statement. Okay? A little practice pointer on that. Now for payoffs. This is a big deal. It is important that we receive payoffs with the lender's information, letterhead, for that payoff. If you're provided with what we call a screen dump, they go to the teller, can you get me a current balance of my loan? Okay, here it is. And it's just this one thing that just shows a number of what their balance is. Or they bring in a payoff on an envelope. Here's my payoff. Right? That won't work. You need to have a payoff that has some kind of letterhead from the lender, because that's going to create a contract between you and that lender. You're going to pay them this big stack of money. They're going to release that mortgage. Sometimes we get a payoff and it's illegible. An illegible payoff doesn't count, because inevitably your payoff to them is going to be short and you're going to be writing a check. Not that I would know anything about this. And so then you have to have a conversation with your staff. Obviously you couldn't read. That was a 7. That's a big deal. That number is a 7. Right? So if it's not legible, that payoff doesn't count. Try again. Okay? It's got to be legible. Credit card payoffs. Every once in a while we get asked to pay off someone's 14 credit cards. My joy. So when we do that, again, it's going to be critical that you have all the account information. When you send that payoff to the credit card company, you send a copy of the credit card statement. Make sure you've got addresses and everything in advance of the closing. They're a complete drag, so a little more care is needed when you have those. It's also important to make sure that you have a proper level of what we call padding of the payoff. And so typically you're going to want to assume a 3 business day amount of per diem that you add to the payoff. Why is that? I get asked that question a lot. Lenders have different cutoff times for when they receive those payoffs. So you never know whether the lender receives that payoff, it's before or after that cutoff time. If it comes in after the cutoff time, lenders typically will not acknowledge receipt of that, and they send it back, which is a drag, because then the payoff hasn't been received, the loan continues to accrue interest. And guess who's going to be responsible for that accrued interest? It's like confession time today. I'm going to be telling all these stories when I wrote checks because of different mistakes that we made. So you want to make sure that you add the proper days of interest on the per diem. Now the settlement statement can also be a very good vehicle for documenting other things that are not necessarily pertinent to the numbers on this transaction. And I gave you some examples there. If you have a situation where you have, for example, a line of credit mortgage, but there's a 0 balance, I still think it's a well-drafted settlement statement to show mortgage to XYZ Bank, 0 balance. Why is that? Because I want to have consistency between my settlement statement and my title opinion. If my title opinion has 2 mortgages, then that settlement statement should have 2 mortgages reflected, whether I'm paying them off or not. Right? A second thing, taxes that were paid outside of closing. So I don't want there to be confusion. The reason why we didn't pay those March taxes is because they were paid outside of closing. So I mark that as POC. Right? If you have a situation where there's an installment contract, I think it's good to memorialize on there how much the transfer tax is going to be. So everybody's clear, the seller's going to have to pay that transfer tax. Here's the amount. And then indicate on there, paid when deed is recorded. Right? So it's a good practice pointer to use that settlement statement to show all kinds of things like that. Another example of this I didn't note in the outline. Sometimes you have a situation where there's an investment property that's changing hands. The security deposit, does that have to be on the settlement statement? No. That can be handled outside of the closing or in the closing. I still think it's a well-drafted settlement statement that memorializes how the security deposit was handled between the seller and the buyer in that transaction. Okay, closing cost credits. I need therapy for this one. That settlement statement has to be a document that memorializes how all the money flows in the transaction. Let that resonate deeply into your core. I can't tell you how many transactions I've had where in the course of that transaction, on the day of the closing, that's when we find out that that closing cost credit that the parties negotiated is too much for what the lender is going to allow. You've been there. I see some heads nodding. This is sloppy loan origination, by the way. Right? We all know what that needs to be well ahead of time. This doesn't have to be the day of the closing that we discover this. But now on the day of closing, we have a problem. I had this happen a week ago. And so the purchase price has been increased to by $2,000, but the lender is only permitting a closing cost credit of $1,500. What happens to those $500? And the common phrase is, well, the parties can just take care of this outside of closing. Right? And in some ways, doesn't that seem logical? I mean, they negotiated that. The seller wasn't planning on getting this extra $500. So what's wrong with the seller just giving that check for $500 outside the closing? They're no better off. The borrower's no better off. Lenders should be happy. Everybody should be happy. Just handle this outside of closing. What's the problem with that? It's mortgage fraud. It's mortgage fraud. I can't tell how many realtors and loan originators we've had to have a heart-to-heart about this. Now, I want to take a look at the language. It's good to look at the language once in a while. That's on your settlement statement. The bottom of page 4. Look at this. For the sellers and buyers, I have carefully reviewed the settlement statement, and to the best of my knowledge and belief, look at this language. It is a true, accurate statement of all receipts and disbursements made on my account or by me in this transaction. And when they allow that off-HUD transaction, off-settlements transaction, you have now crossed into the land of mortgage fraud. But this isn't all. There's more for you. The settlement statement which I have prepared is a true and accurate account of funds received and funds dispersed or to be dispersed for this transaction. Folks, you have to sign that settlement statement. And if it's not an accurate showing, then you've got a problem. Sometimes realtors will say, well, we just want to make sure that Gartin doesn't know about this. All right? That's not helpful either. Because oftentimes I do find out about it. And once I'm notified of an off-HUD transaction, off-settlement statement transaction, what do I have to do with that information? Well, as an attorney, my duty is to whom? The lender. And if you're not an attorney, whose duty do you have contractually? Who's your duty to? The lender. So if it comes to your attention that there is an aspect of this transaction that is not in accord with what the lender understands it to be, we all have a duty to bring that to their attention. Now, it may well be the lender doesn't want to know about this either. Right? And I've had lenders tell me, Tim, I don't want to know about this. And my response is, it's too late. You do know about this. And the response oftentimes, well, go ahead and just close this. You have my permission to close this. And I said, that's fine. I am happy to close this as long as you provide me written instructions to do that. Now, it's amazing what asking for something in writing will do. Right? Very, very quickly, it will sort of flush out the weasels. They're not going to provide that in writing. They can't. And I hate being put in this position by lenders who are sloppy in this work. So this settlement statement is very important that we make sure that it's accurately showing the flow of funds. I could tell war stories on this all day. I've had loan originators at the table reach over to the borrower and say, now for that loan origination fee that's not on the settlement statement, you can just write me that check after the closing. You've got to be kidding me. right? I don't look good in orange, right? I don't. And that's what we're talking about here. I'm going to be wearing an orange jumper. I don't want to do that, right? I've had a realtor, this is one of my favorite stories. The buyer's realtor was there and said, now, about that $10,000 for the excavation work that still needs to be done. I'm like, $10,000? That's not on the settlement statement. What is this about? Oh, we weren't supposed to let you know about this. So, when I talk about the role of ethics, we have an opportunity to help shepherd this process to make sure this is done in a way that nobody's going to get in trouble. Okay? All right. Questions, comments, other war stories?
I got a question.
Yes.
What if you have a dollar amount and the purchase agreement says up to $2,500 and the lender is saying $1,500? Are you covered that way?
So the question is, if the purchase agreement provides for a closing cost credit of up to a particular amount, I actually don't like that. And I really push the parties hard to use a specific dollar amount. Because the reality is that the purchase price was increased to reflect that closing cost credit. And so the way that we handle this is we want to see an actual number in that, a finite number for that credit, not up to that amount. So I'm going to talk with realtors and say, don't use this up to language. Tell us what the amount of that credit is supposed to be.
Okay, so if it doesn't meet that amount, then are you saying you're going to just accept the lender's statement saying we can put $1,500 on the purchase agreement or on the settlement statement?
So are there any other questions? So the question was, so what am I going to do actually if it just says up to? I think if the parties have had a chance to review this, and that is what the number is, and we emphasize to them there are no off-settlement statement transactions, that's okay. I just think it's a slippery slope, right? I don't like fuzzy numbers. I like certainty. And so I don't like that kind of language. So we work with our realtors to help reinforce the value of having certain numbers. Thanks for asking that question. Okay. Any other issues on off-settlement statement transactions? This is one of the most important aspects of your role in this closing, is to make sure that settlement statement is an accurate showing. Because here's the deal, folks. The moment that that settlement statement no longer serves as an accurate documentation of the flow of funds in the transaction, the settlement statement is basically worthless at that point. Then we're only going to just pick and choose what actually gets on there. So we have to be very zealous in protecting that process because it protects everyone in that process. Okay. A couple of other things to work on. We want to make sure that we double-check spellings of names. I hate to go to a closing and I've misspelled someone's name. Right? So try to make sure the spelling is right, addresses, make sure you've got social security numbers, recording costs, make sure you've got those correct. Title guarantee premium, make sure that you've got the right amount for the premium. See the proposed deed. And again, you want to verify how title is vesting and make sure that legal description is right. It is very frustrating to not see the deed until the day of the closing and then realize there's a mistake. Right? So if we can get ahead of that and make those corrections ahead of time, then everyone's better off. Now, you see this language there, number 10. The goal is to provide the settlement statement at least 24 hours in advance of the closing. Yeah, right. But it is. And here's why. What we know is that the risk of mistakes goes up dramatically if the settlement statement is provided on the day of the closing. Right? We know that to be the case. And mistakes generally work against us. I've never had a transaction where I made a mistake and it was a bonus in my favor. I get an extra $500 for this mistake. Wow, this is cool. I have never had that. Mistakes always mean that I end up writing a check. Right? And so we want to work very hard to get the settlement statements out. Now, a ghost of Christmas future. The new Dodd-Frank rules are going to have some language. They're going to create a hard 3-day window in which that settlement statement must be out. Now, when I first heard that, I thought, yeah, right. But somehow, some way, we're all going to have to transition into a world where that settlement statement is out 3 days in advance. Now, as much as I have some questions about Dodd-Frank, this is something that once we figure out how to do this, it will be of some help. It's just going to mean that we have to get out in advance of the transaction earlier to get our work done. But I think this is going to be okay. But there's going to be a big bump as we try to figure out how to do this. Everybody's going to have to sort of recalibrate for that. Okay, questions about the settlement statement so far? All right. So, mechanics lien and notice registry. Oh, question?
When does that 3-day start?
I believe it's going to be July of next year. So the question is, when are we going to get, we're going to get a new settlement statement form. It's going to be a combination of our HUD-1 and the TIL, Truth in Lending, together. And I was on a conference call a year ago. They were discussing this. This sort of weirded me out. The person who was presenting this talked about this new prototype form, and she said it took her 30 minutes to explain this form to a borrower in the closing. 30 minutes. I'm like, okay, this is going to be fun. So I've seen the draft of this, and it's out there on the web if you want to find that. And they've had a long comment period, but it's going to be a big transition for all of us to learn how to use this new form. Thanks for asking that. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to that seller concession, the 3% they get.
Yes.
Isn't it done up to take care of the times when the closing costs don't come up to that, and it gives them so that the borrower is not so much upset that they lowered that because they didn't have enough to meet that high percentage?
Yeah, the question is, so you're trying to go behind the rationale for saying an up to amount. Again, I come back to the issue that I think this is sloppy loan origination work, right? The loan originator knows approximately what those closing costs are going to be, knows what the real estate tax proration credit ballpark is going to be, and that's oftentimes where there's a problem, is that they don't properly think about the real estate tax proration credit. And so that all of a sudden at the last minute, once they see what that credit is, now the sky is falling. And so really press your loan originators to come up with actual hard numbers for that credit. It just makes things much easier. Thanks for asking that question. Okay, a little background on Mechanics Lien Notice Registry. A little bit of background. In 2000, I handled a case called the Baumhoffner Nursery case. And the Baumhoffner Nursery case, and for those of you who are lawyers out there who want the site, it's 618 Northwest 2nd, 363. 618 Northwest 2nd, 363, an Iowa Supreme Court case. And in the Baumhoffner Nursery case, I represented a real estate developer in West Des Moines who was installing nursery stock, trees, onto his properties. And there was a dispute about whether the fellow who dug up the trees in Kelowna, loaded them on a truck, and shipped them over was entitled to a mechanics lien. And let me read you from the case itself. This is the main holding of the case. The record before us reveals without dispute that Baumhofer employees performed the labor involved in digging up and properly packaging 400 trees specifically designed to NASU's contract with Midwest. Midwest, in turn, agreed to incorporate the trees in its landscaping contract with A&D. A&D is the owner. All agreed that the plants would not have survived transplanting in Des Moines, that is, would not have improved A&D's land without proper removal and packaging. Although A&D makes much of the fact that Baumhoffner did not install the trees, that was my argument, they did not install the trees at their final destination, we note that the code pertinently affords lien coverage for labor for an improvement as well as labor upon the improved property. Moreover, we are convinced that the preparatory materials used by Bonhoeffer to secure the root balls fall within the general category of forms, accessories, and equipment. In short, the labor provided and packing materials furnished by Baumhoffner contributed directly to landscaping improvements enjoyed by A&D. Thus, the district court correctly granted Baumhoffner judgment and the right to foreclosure on its timely filed mechanic liens. No ground for reversal appears. So that was my case. I argued that case to the district court and the Supreme Court, and we lost. And when that case came down, I thought the sky had fallen, and here's why. As a closing agent, I have a duty, and this is in 2000, to make sure that I get lien waivers from all parties who provide labor or material for improving the property. And what Baumhoffner Nursery holds is that someone who is off-site, who I have no idea who they are, who is several contractual relationships removed, is going to be entitled to file a mechanics lien and trump a new mortgage. So, as the closing agent, if you were to ask me in light of the Baumhoffner Nursery case, who do we get lien waivers from? My answer would be technically, I don't know. That was a very scary outcome. And I thought everything was going to come to a grinding halt and there would be all these mechanic liens being filed. That never really happened. But it could have, because that's what Baumhoffner holds. Off-site, we don't know who these people are, they're entitled to file a mechanics lien. That's a big deal. And so for those of you closing loans for a living, I don't know whether you've known this or not, but you've been having a lot of risk because you don't know who to properly get mechanic lien waivers from. Isn't that scary? I think that's really scary. So about 5 or 6 years ago, how long has it been, Linda? 5 or 6 years? We started this work on the MLR. There was a discussion about, wouldn't it be nice if we could help make sure that homeowners were aware of when someone did work such that they would be entitled to file a mechanics lien against their property. We were hearing stories of transactions where people didn't realize that work was being done that was going to cause a mechanics lien. And so one of the goals of the mechanics lien and notice registry was to protect Iowans, to make sure there were no surprises. A second purpose of this was to protect the process that we care so much about, so that we know who to get lien waivers from. So it took about 5 years to get this to the legislature. It was really quite a journey. And so Iowa became one of a handful of states that is now what's called a pre-lien notice state. And so what we've done is we've said to contractors and material men, we're not going to tell you whether to do this or not. We're not limiting your ability to file a lien. John Bonhoefner, very nice guy, he could file one of these notices and be entitled to a lien. So nothing that we did affects those parties of people who are entitled to file a mechanics lien. But what we have done is we've said we want to create certainty in this process to make sure we know who is out there. Right? So we now have this new system. It was up and running January 1st, 2013. And again, don't tell anyone, but I was so excited about this. I went into my office on January 1st, 2013 and tried this out. I was so excited. And so much has gone into this. And I want to give a quick plug and thank to Title Guarantee for an amazing number of hours of work that they put into this. The Iowa Bar Association, Frank Fielmeyer with the real estate section, yeoman's work on doing this, and Matt Schultz, the Secretary of State, has done a fantastic job with this. And a whole host of other lawyers and lenders and realtors have had their hand in shaping this. So what do you do with it? So take a look at page 21 of your material. Now, I want to be very clear today that this is not a requirement by Title Guarantee to do this. This is a strong recommendation, but at this point, this is not a requirement. What I'm sharing with you now is what we do in our office. Okay? So, this is my MNLR search verification that I created on January 1st, 2013. I said, okay, we got this cool new tool to use, but how are we going to document the fact that we made these searches? So I put together this little worksheet that allows to document our efforts to search the MNLR. And when we search it, I search it when I do my title opinion. Now, I've had lawyers say to me, Tim, are you telling me that I have to examine the MNLR, go outside the four corners of the abstract when I examine the abstract? And the answer is no, you don't have to do this. But make sure that those who are relying on your title opinions know whether you're searching it or not. So in my title opinion, I have language that says, I am searching the MNLR. But if you don't search it, someone else should be searching the MNLR at the time you do the title work. Because what we're looking for is evidence of contractors or materialmen who have provided notice that they want us to contact them for a lien waiver. Lloyd. Great question. So Lloyd brings up the fact that some abstractors have said, yes, we're going to embrace this, and we're going to continue to do our certification for mechanic liens. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. Abstractors around Iowa are not consistent on what they're doing with the MNLR. All of them that I know of are doing searches for mechanic liens, as they always have. But not all of them are doing searches for the other aspects, other things that you're going to see on the MNLR. So filings of preliminary notices, for example, many abstractors aren't doing a search for that, or at least they're not providing you a certification. So Lloyd brings up an excellent point. The key here is just know what your local abstractor is doing. And so I'm not telling abstractors what to do, right? That's a business decision that you have to make internally. But at least for me, I want to search the MNLR because it's so easy. And in a minute here, Linda's going to do a demonstration for us. And if you haven't done this, you're going to see, wow, this is really simple. So we do a search of the MNLR at the time of the title work. And on the day of the closing, we do another search. And you may think this is nuts, but we do one more search, a third search, if we're doing a filing of a refinance mortgage. I want to cut off even that small window between the closing and the time of filing that refinance mortgage. So in that setting, I'm checking that MNLR 3 times. And I think, oh, Gartin, you're laying on a burden on us. But here's the benefit, and it is a burden I gladly take on. Because now, I don't have to worry about surprises anymore. No more unknown filers out there. So this creates certainty. So I go into that closing and I know who to get lien waivers from. Now, if you have a situation where you find someone that's done work and they provided a preliminary notice, then you need to make sure that you're getting that waiver filed on the MNLR. There's no fee for uploading that on the MNLR. So that someone else down the road, they see that notice filed, and then they see, oh yeah, this is where the release was filed. Right? So it's not enough just to find that and get the release. You want to make sure you post that on the MNLR. Now, to show you how easy this is, I've asked Linda to do a little demonstration. So if you take a look at one of the screens, she's going to demonstrate just how simple it is to do a search on the MNLR. Oh, I can. So here we are, and let's do a search in my county of Story County. So there's a simple logon procedure. You designate the county, and we want the search set up. Yep, the time frames. And this is the difference here. Linda is pointing out that she's collecting all postings. So you can select just commencements of work or preliminary notice. I'm sure abstractors are probably using just the mechanic liens. We're looking at all postings. Now, some of you have come from counties where there are hardly any postings on the MNLR so far. It's like 5 or 6, right? Nobody's doing this yet. And so it's really easy. You just look on there. My property is not one of those 5 or 6. Couldn't be any easier. Polk County, you've got a lot of filings now. And so even in Story County, we're starting to get a few. And so it may be more than you want to just eyeball through. But you could, if you have a legal description, you could just eyeball through that list. Go back to the search screen. The MNLR provides you with a search engine where you can put in the terms of the legal description, so it's on the Secretary of State's website, on the search feature, it's a pull-down menu for MNLR. And so what this does is it goes through the legal description, the tax parcel ID, property address, you can do a search there, property owner, general contractor. I think that's all of them, isn't it? Yeah. Those are the main ones you're going to want to search. So it's very, very simple to do this. Folks, if I have to weigh, yes, this is an extra step in the process compared to the benefit, the certainty that we provide the transaction, it is a no-brainer. I am so happy with the MNLR. Gartin needs some new hobbies. Thank you, Linda. Yes?
At one time when they first initiated this, they said you had to be able to exactly type it in as it was filed. Is that still a true statement?
So the question is, do you have to do the search exactly it was typed in?
The contract where always they maybe has the legal description slightly off or an address, drive instead of yard.
That's correct. So I think it's good to search multiple ways just to make sure you try to capture. The question was, what if the legal description isn't right? The MNLR doesn't change the rules that we have in Iowa about how to file a properly perfected mechanics lien. So if there were defects before, there'd be defects now. But in terms of the search, you want to search different ways, particularly in counties where you have lots of postings. Okay. Yes? Great question. So the question is, if you don't do the closing, you're just providing the title opinion, what do you do with this MLR, if anything? And I would say that's up to you as the attorney. So what I do on like say for example, a cash transaction that I'm not closing, I'm going to do the title opinion, I'm going to fill out my MNLR worksheet, I'm going to slap it on my abstract and send that to Robin Gregory at Century 21. When she gets that, she can see that I've already done that first search. Okay? Sorry to make you famous there, Robin. Yes? So I'm going to search everything.
I thought commercial files are not required to do that, or not even do it.
Well, the question is on the commercial, do you want to have a title guarantee person speak to the commercial side? Right, so just to summarize this, it's still a wise thing to check to make sure whether the mechanic liens. I'm going to search either way. I mean, oftentimes when I'm examining the abstract, I don't necessarily know how that property is going to be used anyway. And so I'm going to do that search regardless. Matt?
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you, Tim, that the title standards committee has met last week. We talked about the mechanics of the registry. We're proposing a title standard to address that, and that's going up to the real estate section council for their consideration. They pass on it before the governor. What it says is, if there is the notices don't, and it also says that the notices and the notice of commencement and preliminary notice do not need to be included in the abstract. Those searches are often done outside the abstract.
So this is a helpful update from Matt. So stay tuned. The Title Standards Committee is working on some more information that's going to clarify how these different roles are going to be fulfilled. So thanks, Matt, for cluing us in on some of that. I got to keep moving here. Page 6. There are a couple of points that you want to emphasize with lenders, particularly out-of-state lenders that you're not used to working with all the time. Again, every title holder and their spouse must join in giving this mortgage. And I've cited the Wells Fargo case if you need some ammunition for this. There's another case that I didn't cite in the outline that it's important to note. This is the Ortiz decision. It's 776 Northwest 2nd, 111. 776 Northwest 2nd, 111. This is a transaction where the borrower was Hispanic and he was using a interpreter. When asked about his marital status, Ortiz informed the translator that he was separated. Through the translation, it was then indicated on the note and mortgage, through the translation, it was then indicated on the note and mortgage that Ortiz was single. When the note and mortgage were executed in March 2004, however, Ortiz was in fact married. He married Josefina Rodriguez de la Torre in Mexico in February or March 2002, and his spouse separated in August of 2002. He then obtained a divorce in Mexico that was not finalized until August of 2006. Here's the holding. Despite the apparent inequities, the court finds, based upon this record viewed in a light most favorable to Ortiz, that the mortgage executed by Ortiz on March 22, 2004 is invalid. So what he did was, he understood the question. He thought it was, are you together? Right? He was legally married, but he was separated. The court held the mortgage is invalid and void due to the lack of execution of his spouse, and pursuant to Iowa Code, because this mortgage is invalid, foreclosure is unavailable to Nationwide absent some other theory of recovery. Ouch. This Ortiz case is an important case because sometimes we're working with borrowers who don't speak English. So it's very important that we have someone there to help make sure that we understand marital status as well as all these other terms. We'll talk about non-native speakers here in a moment. But this issue on marital status, because of Ortiz, makes it very clear the burden is on us as a closing agent to make sure that that part is not misunderstood. Okay? So those are two very important things. Escrow agreements. Sometimes there is work that cannot be done ahead of time, and there has to be some kind of escrow agreement. I've provided an example, Exhibit 3 for form. Here's a couple pointers on this. You should only agree to an escrow if and only if the nature of that work can be determined. Okay? So if in the course of the final walkthrough they find the toilet doesn't work. Okay, we have a sense of what toilets cost. You set aside 150% in an escrow. You get the work taken care of. The transaction closes. Everybody's fine. But what happens if instead there's evidence of water damage on a wall? How do you know how much to escrow? And the answer is you don't. And you are in the firing line here because the lender wants to close. The buyer is nervous, but they think maybe they should close. They got the moving van and the 5 cats. The seller wants their money. They want to close this. And the realtor, do you think they want their commission? Absolutely. Right? So sometimes you provide the sanity that says, you know, I'm not so sure this is the kind of thing that we should escrow for. We need to make sure we get a contractor out there to make sure we have a sense of the extent of the damage that's been caused so that we know how much money to escrow. Sometimes closings should not happen. Right? It's okay. It's okay to drop back and punt. Sometimes you provide a service by saying, no, everybody take a deep breath. Let's hold off. Let's get some more information and decide whether this should close. You're not doing anyone a favor by trying to push something forward if it's not supposed to happen. Okay? escrow agreements. Addressing title objections. This is really funny because, okay, so the rule on this is we want to make sure that our file is very clear on how particular title objections were addressed. You don't want to have happen what happened to me 2 weeks ago. I mean, this was like a nightmare for me. So a closing downstream happens, and there are all these title issues that I addressed in my title opinion for the closing I did, but apparently none of those things were done. I mean, I'm looking at my outline, I'm thinking, oh, this is exactly why we do this. And I have no idea how this happened, right? Confession time. Don't tell anyone. But my file gave no indication how these particular judgments and issues were all addressed. I'm like, right? This is terrible. So you want to make sure that your file properly documents how all objections were taken care of. Powers of attorney. You doing okay? Okay, a few more minutes and then we'll take a break. Powers of attorney. Powers of attorney used to be really easy, and suddenly they become really hard because lenders now have become a little more particular about what goes in that power of attorney. I have a standardized form. You've got a copy of it in the materials. I would fill that out. I never had pushback on that. No longer the case. So you want to make sure that if a power of attorney is going to be used, you send that well in advance to the lender for their approval. So they may want to know the legal description, of course that has to be there, the property address, they might want to know the loan number, sometimes the length of time. The legal description doesn't have to be there technically, but it's a good practice because it's got to be recorded, right? So we have to have that legal description there. But that's not all. Turn to page 7. Now, lenders are going to tell us as real estate lawyers in Iowa how to execute documents. That drives me nuts. Because I know how to properly execute a document in Iowa with the power of attorney. You see the example there, 2A, that's how it's done. As long as the signature block indicates that this person is signing in a representative capacity, that's a properly executed document. That'll stand up in court. But now I have lenders saying, no, that's not good enough. We know better, and we want you to sign in one of these other variations. On a couple of occasions, I've had to have borrowers come back and re-sign documents from scratch because we didn't understand that that's what the lender wanted. That doesn't go over very well. So you want to make sure that you clarify with the lender precisely how is it you want the borrowers to sign their name. And don't try to argue them out of it. It's not going to work. You just sort of go along with the goofy way they want it to be signed. But the key here is just make sure that you understand what the lender wants. Now, let's do this, 11 o'clock. Let's take a 10-minute break. I've got a lot of material to cover, so we'll start back here in 10 minutes. If you have questions, come on up. Over time, I've realized that there are some efficiencies that we can build into this process by using stamps. So I've given you one of them. So sometimes a lender will provide you a set of documents where there's going to be a signature by representative capacity, but the document isn't set up that way. Here's a little stamp, so you can go to your stamp store and have them make a stamp like this. And it's really pretty helpful. So you just go through and just cha-ching on all those documents where they're going to be signed that way, and that's a helpful little tool. The subject of dealing with the federal government, short sale transactions, and relocation companies is really almost a seminar by itself. Perhaps best done with adult beverages. That shouldn't be on the videotape. So, just a couple of practice pointers as we think about this. Dealing with these kinds of parties are just going to be more involved. So you just have to wrap your brain around this. Here's a closing that's going to take more time and energy. Usually they're going to require that settlement statement much earlier in the process. And so you have to communicate to all the other parties, the lender who's financing this transaction, all the realtors, everybody come along to the party. We've got a reload. We've got a Fannie Mae situation. And we've got to make sure things are done early. So you just have to calendar this in a different manner. And then you have the frustration of the company wanting the settlement statement to be set up the way that they want. And I have to tell you, I've gone back and forth on this, and let me tell you where I am. Some of these reload situations, they can be a one deed or a two deed transaction. And for a long time, I've dug in my heels and I've said, if it's going to be a one deed transaction, the reload company cannot be shown as the seller on the settlement statement because they've never been a title holder. And therefore, according to me, there's actually these rules discussing how the HUD-1 is to be prepared. And what it says is the seller is the seller. That's all the definition we're provided by the federal government in preparing these things. So I say to myself, I'm a small lawyer, country lawyer, right? But I can figure this out. The seller means the person who's a title holder. So I said, no, we're not going to do this. If you want to be on the settlement statement, the most I'll allow you to do is to be the agent for the seller. Otherwise, you have to go to a two deed transaction. Then we have seller to reload company to buyer. Then I can put you as the seller on my settlement statement. And I have fought this battle, and I finally sort of threw in the towel on this. And here's why. There is documentation that exists between the seller and the reload company that establishes that the reload company has acquired the equitable title of this property. And that's sort of the argument. And there's been some tax issues as well that play into this, that we have some authority, a bit marginal in my opinion, but we still have some authority that allows us now to show that reload company as the seller, even though they are not a title holder in the transaction. So if you have more questions on that, see me later this evening. Okay. One other practice pointer on reloads, and this is a huge frustration of mine. They will oftentimes send the deed, and there'll be no language for the grantee line of the deed. They expect you to fill that out, right? So I don't like that part. And then if they do have the language, the grantees, oftentimes there is nothing there with respect to joint tenancy. Now guys, this is a real takeaway from today's seminar. Lean in on this. I can't get these people to put the joint tenancy language on this deed. Every time I get one of these, I call the preparer and we have the same conversation, and I will continue to do this and bang the drum every transaction. I need you to help me with that. Because if you're not paying attention and John and Jane Doe take title to this property and it doesn't say joint tenancy, what's the default? Tenancy in common. John Doe dies, Jane Doe then finds out she's got to probate her husband's estate. You're going to get sued. I'm not sure whether you're going to win or not, but you're going to get sued because you allowed this to happen. And so we are very vigilant on the issue of deeds coming to us in that setting. So make sure you know whether the language is there. File preparation, so key. And this is sort of a fun thing. This is where we're going to get to sort of share some internal practices. You get to come to my office and see how we prepare a file, right? We highlight signatures and initial spots on all the packages. Not everyone does that. Here's why. Missing a signature is always bad. And I've had transactions where I've missed a signature and I found myself at an Arby's in Altoona at 10 o'clock at night. Because that's where the only place they could meet me. You're kidding me. We have to go to Arby's in Altoona. I'm not sure it was Arby's, but I had to come to Altoona at 10 o'clock at night to get your signature. Yep, that's where we're going to be. Okay, I'm along for the ride because I screwed up. I didn't get that signature. So we highlight just to help the borrower's eyes as they go through that closing package to make sure they see where to initial and sign. Now, I'm still watching them sign as well, but it's amazing how they sort of get trained into looking for that highlighting in the package. Huge fan of that. We also highlight the Social Security number on the W-9 to make sure one last time that the Social Security number is correct. I haven't had a wrong Social Security number in years, but we still always highlight that and ask them in the closing, is this your correct Social Security number? We double check the names and the marital status on the mortgage. If there's some variations, like on a refinance, be sure to use AKA, FKA, those different name variations. We confirm the legal description. We make copies of the borrowers. Folks, don't make copies on the big paper. Reduce it to 8.5 by 11. Nobody has a file cabinet for legal size paper. So give them a set of copies, 8.5 by 11, double-sided, to make it as small as possible for them to be able to take home. We have our borrowers sign in blue ink because I can't tell oftentimes the original from a copy. We just have them sign in blue ink, right? If there is a line of credit, this is where I need to talk about this again. You need to make sure that the borrowers on a refinance or the sellers on a purchase are signing instructions to close a line of credit. Now, oftentimes those instructions will come with the payoff. But if they don't, page 29 provides you with a letter of instruction to close an open-end line of credit loan. There you go. That's all you need. On page 30, just flip over, this is a sample organizational list of that closing package. And the way we put this together. So settlement statement, signature affidavit, or signature addendum, note, till, mortgage, temporary payment coupon, first payment letter. Again, we want to remind borrowers this is what your monthly payment is. Initial escrow disclosure statement, itemization amount finance, notice of right to cancel for refinance. And then we finish up with the loan application, composite mortgage affidavit, title guarantee attendance form, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then you see the borrower's copies there in that order. Now, that's not set in stone. Some of you put the loan application first. So there's some flexibility in this. This is just how we do this. All right, page 9, suggestion for high volume days. I wanted to have a section just to zero in because closing one transaction is a different beast than if you have, and whatever a high number is for you, maybe 10 is a high number of closings for you. And there are special considerations that have to be taken into account. And I've given you some pointers here. Number 1, order lunch for your staff. You like that, staff, people who are closing this? Order lunch. Yeah, get some applause over there. You can take this home and show the boss, hey, he said to order lunch. So, and I'm kidding and I'm not kidding. We want to make sure that we keep fuel in the tank. And the pragmatic thing for you, if you're sitting down and closing 10 closings a day, you got to make sure you keep hydrated and all that stuff so that you have enough energy by the time you get to closing number 10. I love a day when I get to close 10 transactions in a day. I love that. All right? That's really fun. And I think it's fun for my staff because we get to really sort of ramp up and see what we're made of. Right? A lot of logistics have to come together. I think it's a rush. But you want to make sure that you take care of your staff. Make sure that files don't get mixed up. I'm really hardcore about this. We don't have documents floating around the office. That freaks me out. And when you're prepping a file, you have the other file closed so you don't get documents intermingling. That's never good. Never good. Number 3, double check. Money in, money out. This is where we make mistakes. Oh, the wire didn't come in for the Smith closing. Uh-oh. Money in, money out. Don't forget to double check that. Remind your loan officers that you're going to be on a tight schedule so that they can let the borrowers know to arrive on time. Some people are real sloppy in this, and they'll show up for a 10 o'clock closing at 10:15. Man, what is up with that? You have your next closing at 10:30. So that's going to throw everything off. So encourage people to be on time if they can be. If a file is showing itself to be a problem file, then don't let that tail wag the dog. Suggest, hey, you know what, this closing isn't working out, folks. We need to move this to the back of the line because this could take all day. So you have to maintain some control. Bring in extra staff if you have to make sure things are sane. And then number 7, give lots of grace to people. This is something, and I know there's a lot of mechanics we're covering, but the way in which we treat people is important. Title Guarantee printed off a copy of an essay I did for them a couple years ago. Give that to your staff. This is good stuff. And what I'm basically trying to do is encourage people to be nice. Right? It's amazing how grouchy and irritable and short people can be when things are crazy in the middle of a summer, right? And so the opportunity to show grace in the midst of fire is really, really important. Try to reduce the drama. Number 8, show appreciation for your staff. I have had conversations with people who have been in offices where they've had really heavy days and there's no appreciation for the staff. They've been put through the ringer and the person in charge seems like they could care less. And if your staff is leaving in tears at the end of the day, you need to take some ownership of that. And I'm very serious about that. Take care of the people who are taking care of you. Fundamental. They don't teach this stuff in law school, by the way. If you're wondering why your lawyer is a schmuck, they don't teach niceness in law school. But I'm here to tell you, you will kill those staff. Conversely, if you take care of the people who take care of you, you will create loyalty and you'll keep those people for a long time. And they'll be happy. So that's really important. I don't want to minimize that. Number 9, look at the schedule beyond that busy day to make sure that there aren't other things that you're not going to be asked to do. So try to leapfrog on the schedule to manage your workload. And then if you have some files that really don't have to close that day, then talk to the lender and say, hey, I've got 10 closings this day. Is there any way that this refinance can take place the next day? Because that'd really help us out. So call in some favors on this. You stay late, you help them out to get a transaction done. They need to help you out and move some transactions along to help keep you sane. So there's some suggestions. Any other pointers on high volume days you want to share? Anything else? Okay. Execution of the loan documents. Critical thing. Before any closing I do, I go through this mental exercise. And here's what I do. I remind myself that the people I'm going to be working with, this is new for them. This is a unique transaction. And it's a big transaction. And I need to let that color the way in which I do my closing. So many times the closing is, here, sign this, and you're out the door. And you wonder, did I just buy a house? Was that what that was? This is a big deal for these people, right? Now, I'm not suggesting you take all day for this closing. My closings generally take 30 minutes to do, and I think that's a good target duration for your closing. But I think, you know, when we do this time and time again, you know that settlement statement cold. But they don't. And you need to remember who's on the other side of this table. And they're nervous, right? Sometimes a borrower is going to be argumentative or difficult to work with. And when I first started doing closings, this sort of freaked me out. I'm like, man, why the attitude? Right? I'm just here to close the loan. Why am I getting a third degree on this? Well, a lot of times, people who are in a setting, they're nervous about it. It's a lot of money. The way that comes out is sort of a defense mechanism. They got a bit of a wall. And so don't take it personally if there's a bit of an attitude. You've got to see past the attitude and deal with the person in the closing. Right? That makes sense? So don't get bent out of shape if they're all grouchy. In fact, I'm at a point now where I actually sort of like that. Right? That's going to be sort of a challenge. So I want to take them from a status of being freaked out and nervous and scared to a place where they walk out of my office and they feel like, wow, I actually understood that. There's value in those people leaving your office that way. That's the vision I have. And I go through this mental exercise every time I sit down to do a closing. Your role as a notary, page 9. This is a big deal here in Iowa. And what I've done is I've given you the actual language from the Iowa Code. I want to take you to the top of page 10. A notarial officer who takes an acknowledgement of a record shall determine, look at this, from personal knowledge or satisfactory evidence of the identity of the individual, that the individual appearing before the notarial officer and making the acknowledgement has the identity claimed, and that the signature on the record is the signature of the individual. There are no exceptions to this rule. You have a very important role as a notary. And sometimes this thing is poo-pooed, but it's a very important deal. And so I've had a transaction, this was really funny. This is a long time ago. I had a major real estate developer in Ames come to do a transaction, and he shows up, and his wife's not there. And I said, well, is your wife planning to attend? Or do you have a power of attorney? He said, no, I always just sign for her. Wow. Well, not anymore. That closing actually didn't go very well. She was busy. She was doing something else, and I was the bad guy because I made her come and sign the documents. Right? Isn't that funny? But we have situations, though, that aren't quite as egregious. Situations like, hey, can I just run this out to my car? My spouse is in the car, kids are sleeping. Can I just have my spouse sign it and then bring it? No, you can't do that. Bundle up, go out in the car, watch the spouse sign. Right? That's what it takes. So all those signatures have to be done in your presence, and you have to know the identity of the person that you're working with. Now, this is not a requirement. For a long time we didn't do this, but we now use a notary log. Some of you are groaning like, oh, okay, Tim, and one more thing I have to do. So this is not a requirement under Iowa law, but it's strongly recommended. If you have a high-volume office, just to try to reduce the issues of fraud, I recommend that you think about using a notary log. So that's there if you want to do that. You can get it to the Secretary of State's office. They have information on that. Okay. And make sure your notary has not expired. Every once in a while there'll be a situation where you don't pay attention and the notary expires, so don't let that happen. Oh, yes?
If your stamp expires, but you are not expired, you can cross that out.
The question is, can you correct the stamp? You can, but you're going to invite a question from your recorder. So try to get out in front of that and make sure that you don't let your stamp show the wrong date either. Some stamps don't have the date of expiration and you have to handwrite that in every time. I think it's easier to get a stamp put together that shows your expiration date on the stamp. Just easier. Thanks for asking that question. All right. So in a few minutes, we're going to do an actual demonstration of part of a closing. All right? You think, I do this for a living, Tim, but this is okay. Bear with me. We're going to actually do a little bit of a closing up here on the table. A couple things just to talk about before we actually do it. First of all, explain what the goals are for the meeting. They need to know that it's okay to ask questions of you, right? I ask the person to sign the documents just the way they're typed, and I actually tell them the date, because I don't want to rely on their understanding of the date. Have you ever had documents, the person put the wrong date? I had a transaction to go to someone's house, 10 o'clock at night. This is sort of a theme here, right? They're 10 o'clock at night. They put the next day's date. No, you have to put today's date. And lenders actually care about this. So I remind them of today's date. With respect to the settlement statement, a couple of pointers on there. I highlight that title guarantee owner's policy, and so should you. Title guarantee is so awesome in providing these free owner policies. Talk to people who buy these owner policies in other states. Find out they're going to spend $200 or $300 in another state for an Iowa we give away for free. And I want to highlight that. So every closing, I'm highlighting that so that the lender hears that and the realtor hears that, because they don't provide that in other states. It's awesome. So I'm going to highlight that. You'll hear that in a moment. In a new construction, I think it's important to explain how the taxes are handled. So in a new construction, the taxes are based on today's taxes, based on the unimproved lot. And so eventually, that's why the credit is so small, eventually the taxes are going to be based about typically 18 months afterwards the taxes are going to be based on the improved upon lot. And their escrow that we're setting up today is going to be short. And so what I recommend is that a buyer in a new construction, two-step dance, call your county treasurer's office and ask about when the taxes will be implemented and how much. Now that you know that, then contact the lender and say, look, this is what's going to happen with my taxes. How are you going to handle that? And the lender is either going to say, okay, congratulations, please send us $1 gajillion, or they'll say, for the next 6 months, you can start building up that escrow account. The key is that I want the buyer to walk out with a sense of direction on how to handle the taxes for that new construction. Okay? Explain how prepaid interest worked and when that first payment's going to happen. Explain the tax proration credit. If the transaction's in early summer, remind them that they're going to be receiving a statement from the county showing them what their taxes are going to be. And I get lots of phone calls. Tim, I'm getting this statement. I thought I had an escrow account. And I remind them at the closing, read down a little bit further on that tax statement because it will say, if you're escrowing for taxes, this is not a bill. They will notice that statement after they have their heart attack. All right? So give them a little heads up. That statement is coming. Promissory note, truth in lending. You'll hear I talk about that. Mortgage. Other standardized forms. We get to the form talking about homeowners insurance. That's a good place to remind buyers that they are free to change their homeowners insurance carrier anytime they like. Just make sure that there's no gap in the coverage. Sometimes when you have an escrow account that's covering your insurance, it feels like you're locked into that particular carrier, but you're not. Just make sure, though, there's no gap in the coverage. So that's an important thing to know. Occupancy statement. Boy, this is an important thing. Remind them, hey, this is where the lender is. One last reminder that this is the place where you're living. And so that occupancy statement means something. The loan application, very important. What I say on this is that this is the last time the lender is verifying that in essence your financial status has not changed. You're in essence the same borrower today as when you started this transaction. For example, you haven't changed jobs. You haven't gone out and bought a new car. Any kind of major transaction that would change the way that a lender views you in the course of this transaction. I'll tell you some more stories in a moment about that. The closing attendance form. Page 31. This is new, and not all of you are doing this. Title guarantee is asking us now, Matt, is this a requirement? It's not a requirement, so you should be doing it. If you're not, you shouldn't. So this is a closing attendance record. And why do we do this? Title guarantee has been in enough scrapes over issues of who is physically present at the time of closing that we're now memorializing this. So the realtors, the lender, someone's dad who showed up, everybody signs off on this, and you just put that with your file. Okay? For some of you, that's new. The form of the funds, very important. We emphasize and we try very hard to make sure this is done right in advance. The form of the funds, unless it's a really small amount, it has to come in certified funds or wire transfer. Right? And I get a lot of pushback on this. You know, Tim, why can't I write a personal check for $47,000? And even if it's only for $4,000, here's why. And make sure we understand this. Your trust account that you administer, it's actually not one big bucket. It's more accurate to think of your trust account as a series of buckets. So if you take a personal check for $4,000, you deposit that check, it's about a week before that money actually arrives to honor that check. What you've done in the meantime is you've pulled money from other people's buckets to satisfy this transaction. You can't do that. If you're an attorney and you have an IOLTA trust account, you're violating the terms of your IOLTA trust account. Right? So pay attention to the issue of the form of funds. And then a few final reminders that I give to the borrower. I always explain joint tenancy to them. And so I say to John and Jane Doe, this is the deed where you're taking title. And I just want to point out to you that you're taking title today as joint tenants. That's how 95% of couples in Iowa own their real estate. And what that means is, if one of you passes on, the surviving joint tenant would immediately own this real estate without the need of probating an estate. And I think that's a very important thing. When I sit down and work with couples to work on their wills, the number one thing we talk about is how that couple owns their real estate. So I remind them of that. That's exactly the language that I give.
Question?
Yes.
On a mortgage,
Yes.
a lot of our lenders put in joint tenancy, something besides the husband and wife. They put in the extra blurb. Is that necessary?
So the question is, what happens when the lender adds joint tenants with full right of survivorship on the mortgage itself? And that has absolutely no bearing on the validity of the mortgage. They could put their favorite flavor of ice cream, you name it. Has no bearing on the validity of the mortgage. What does matter is marital status. Every title holder and their spouse. It's tattooed to my arm. Just trust me. It's tattooed to my arm. You can tattoo it as well. It's very important. And yes, question over here.
You, on the borrower's funds, you say certified funds or wire transfer. What about cashier's check?
Yes, if it's some kind of bank draft that they can't cancel that's the kind of forms that you need for the account.
All right, so there's a whole bunch of law out there somewhere in Never Never Land about the right to stop payment on cashier's checks.
Okay, any other questions? I mean, the reality is, the question is, what about the issue, a cashier's check technically can be canceled. That's true. And it's a risk that we sort of take into account. I also take an attorney's trust account check if I know that attorney. I used not to do that. And I would say, don't take my check, but things have loosened up a little bit with this issue. So if I get a check from another attorney's law firm trust account from a closing, I would accept that as well because it's an audited trust account. So thanks for asking that question. It's not the kind of answer I want to give, but it's the answer that I have to give. Yes? I'm so glad you brought this up. So the question is, there's some pending legislation that's going to change the presumption. So if John and Jane Doe take title as husband and wife, that will create a presumption of joint tenancy. This is long overdue. I've been pleading for this for a long time. So stay tuned on that. At least for today, we still need to recite the joint tenancy. But I'm not sure the status of that and when that's going to take effect. So stay tuned on that. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay. I also encourage buyers to sign up for the homestead tax credit. And I provide my buyers, page 32, I've given you a sample. I want to give them written instructions on how to sign up for that homestead tax credit. And you'll see that. And for the counties that you do most of your transactions in, customize it for that particular county. So I have this form set up for the counties around where I practice. And then I have a standardized one for the whole state. So take advantage of something like this to give your buyers and explain they need to sign up for that homestead tax credit. Typically you want to wait at least a week before signing up for the credit because the assessor's office won't know about the transaction. So wait at least a week, but before July 1st to make sure that's in place. So always give that at the end to reinforce that. I provide the abstract to the buyer at the time of closing. Now, some of you work in counties where, because of pencil notes, you don't have the ability to do this. I think that's sad because I think that's a total waste of time. I apologize if I've just offended anyone in those counties. But it's so easy to just say, here's your abstract at closing and not have to have that abstract come back later on. And then I have to get it back to the buyers and they don't know what it is. So much easier to say at closing, here is your abstract. Sign here for it. I gave you a sample receipt form. You'll want to store this abstract in a lockbox or fire safe. It's $1,000 to replace this. and you're not going to need it again until the day comes when you go to sell the property. I think if you can give that information at the time you're handing off the abstract, you're significantly increasing the chances of that abstract being well cared for, as opposed to the fact they come back 3 months later, pick it up, and they throw it in the back seat for who knows how long. Right? So I like the idea of being able to hand that abstract over at the time of closing. Yes? Yes, that's a good point. Lloyd brings up a good point. So the reason why we can provide that abstract is because the abstractor, after the closing, emails or faxes us the post-closing search to make sure that all the information that we need for our final title policy is all in place. Thanks, Lloyd, for bringing that up. Yes?
In the metro area, just as a tip, what we do in our office, we give the homestead exemption notice on one page of a colored piece of paper, so it doesn't blend in with white paper. And on the other side, we have a list of all the locations of the various abstract offices with addresses whenever we circle which company has their abstract. So if they are looking for it in the future, they know where to go.
So that's a great practice point, and I hope you heard some of this. And just to summarize this, for those who are in the metro area where there are pencil notes, provide guidance as far as which abstractor was involved in this transaction, who would have that abstract during the interim time, and explain how to sign up for that homestead tax credit. Thanks for bringing that up. Yes, ma'am?
You can't give the borrower the abstract with the pencil notes. I think the problem is that when you fear that if the pencil notes are gone, then it's like starting over on that section of the abstract. I think that's why that practice is not easy, but you can, in the metro area, you can give the abstract out of the
So I'm curious, and this is new, and this I'm glad I came to this conference today. I'm learning something.
We don't do it in our office.
So I'm curious, is there anyone in the metro area that does give an abstract with pencil notes to the buyer? Anyone do that? No? Okay. You do? Okay. So that's good that it is being done. Then you just want to really emphasize the importance of maintaining those pencil notes. Thanks for bringing that up. A couple miscellaneous pointers. In the course of this closing, there may be some downtime that you have while the documents are being signed. Maybe an issue comes up, the realtor wants to talk about something. Take advantage of that moment to flip through the documents and make sure everything is signed and dated appropriately. I can't tell how many times I thought everything was signed, and I took advantage of that moment break in the action, and I found, lo and behold, I missed a signature, or I missed a date. Right? So take advantage of that little practice pointer. I'm also at the closing table. If I haven't already seen the transfer documents, I also want to make sure that I got all of those properly filled out, the deed, deck, and groundwater. Okay, so, and also with automatic payment. Oftentimes you'll be provided with an automatic payment form for the buyer. That's a form that you can explain how to fill that out. And I always give this reminder. When that first payment pulls, double check and make sure that payment comes out correctly the first time. Because there's a whole lot of numbers that someone has to hand enter in order to set up that electronic transfer. We've had some calls where people checked over their noon hour and found the payment hadn't come out yet. They were concerned. Typically, that payment comes out at the end of the day. So I would check that automatic payment for the first time it comes out, but I would check that evening or the next day just to make sure it comes out. Once it comes out correctly the first time, it should be fine going forward. So those are a couple of the practice pointers. And Teresa, where are you? Teresa, come on up. Teresa's going to help us out today. And we're actually going to do a little bit of a practice closing. Teresa, hi, I'm Tim Gartin.
Hi, Tim.
Nice to meet you. Hey, I'm happy to help you with your closing today. First time purchase?
First time purchase.
Fantastic.
Nervous.
Nervous? You know, I'll tell you this. I love doing real estate closings, and I will love to do your 10th closing, but I think there's really something exciting about that first closing. And so this is a setting that you're not used to doing. Let me encourage you to ask questions as we go along here today. I'm going to show you what I think of as the important terms, but I just want to encourage you to ask questions as we go along, okay? I've got a complete set of copies here for everything that you're going to sign. So we're going to start our time today with the settlement statement. And we start with the settlement statement because this is the document that shows how all the money flows in the transaction. So the way this is structured, we have the seller side here and the buyer side here. So this upper portion is showing the gross amount due from you. And as you might expect, that's going to be the sum of the purchase price and the settlement charges. Now that settlement charge line, that's the sum of this column. And you see a lot of numbers. Well, the reason why is this settlement statement has to show how all those parts fit together. All the numbers that are involved in this transaction are shown here. So let's walk through these. In this section, we have the loan origination costs from the lender. This line is for the interest that you're prepaying for the use of this money for the balance of this month. So you're prepaying this month's interest. As a result, you don't have a payment next month. So we get to skip next month. You don't have a payment then till the following month. Sometimes there's confusion on when that first payment is. So no payment next month, but it's the following month you have your first payment. We are prepaying your first year's homeowner's insurance in the course of the closing. And then coming down here, we have the settlement charges. Here we have the escrow account for taxes and insurance. Each month, these are the funds going into the account for your taxes and insurance. And then we're collecting 3 months of insurance and 2 months of taxes to hold in this escrow account. Now, the way this escrow account works is that it's holding money for, in essence, a moving target. And so every year the lender will have to adjust this to make sure the amounts being held are correct. So typically it's once a year you'll get a notice that there's some adjustment that will be needed. Your title charges, abstracting, title, and the closing. And I want to point out to you this line item right here, the owner's policy. What that policy represents is a policy that protects you in the event the abstractor made a mistake or I made a mistake in examining it. And what's more, this policy protects you for as long as you own this property, and in Iowa, Title Guarantee provides this for free. This is awesome. And I have a little brochure here that talks more about what that owner's policy covers, so that's there for you in your set of copies. Cost of recording the deed and mortgage, pest inspection that was there, and so that figure comes back to the first page, added to the purchase price. We have the gross amount due from you. Now, when you started this process, Teresa, you put $5,000 down as earnest money. That's money that you don't have to pay again today. This is a credit to you in this closing. We have the amount here that you're borrowing. This is a credit back to you from the lender because there was an amount that was out of tolerance, and so they credited that back to you. And then we have the real estate tax proration credit. Let me explain where this number comes from. As of today, the seller owes taxes on this property for the coming year. Now, these sellers, let's just assume they're very nice people. Even with that, it would be very clunky and awkward to leave them responsible for the taxes for your house. So what we have instead is a process where we ask the seller to pay their taxes that they owe, prorated through the day, in the course of the closing. So we're taking from the seller what they owe in closing, and we're giving that to you as a credit. That's money that, again, you don't have to pay today. Now, let me fast forward the calendar 5 years, 20 years. Someday, you're going to sell this house, and you're going to be in a similar situation. At that point, you'll be giving credit to your buyers for basically a year's worth of taxes. When we add this section and subtract it from the upper section, the amount we need from you becomes that figure. Questions on that? Is that what you're expecting it to be?
Will I have to pay these taxes at the courthouse then when they come due?
Great question. Will you have to pay these taxes before they come due? The answer is no. You have an escrow account back here on page 2 where it's been set up to take care of those taxes as they come due. So taxes in Iowa are paid in September and March, and your lender is all set up to take care of that. Now, as a reminder, you'll be receiving a statement in late July, early August from the county that will tell you what your taxes are. Now, remember, it's going to say in small print, if you are escrowing for taxes, this is not a bill. But every year, we always get lots of calls because people forget that. But just remember, the escrow account's all set up for that. Thanks for asking that question. Good. All right, so for this then, I will ask you to sign and date. Now, word of instruction. Lenders have become very picky on this. I need you to sign just the way it's signed, it's typed below the line, and have you put today's date. And even though this may not be the way you normally sign your name, the lender still wants you to sign there, in this case with your middle initial. Okay, so we've talked through the terms of the loan, Teresa. I want to take you now to the promissory note. And the promissory note is your promise to repay this money. And we've already talked through those terms back on page 3 of the settlement statement, but I want to show you the terms as they appear in the promissory note today. So this is showing, this is the principal you're borrowing, interest rate right here. This is a 30-year fixed rate loan. And over here, this is showing that there is no prepayment penalty. That means you can sell the house, refinance the loan. There's never a penalty for paying off the loan. I emphasize this because some loans will have a prepayment penalty, yours does not. So that's always important to note. You've got a standard 15-day window in which to make the payment. Due on the 1st, not late to the 15th. Now, in a transaction, when it's an adjustable rate mortgage, we do this. So, Teresa, this is what's called an adjustable rate mortgage. And so let's talk through the terms of this. So this is set up initially as a 30-year fixed rate loan. And so the way it's set up, initially the amount of your principal and interest is this figure right here. Interest rate, first payment not due until this date. Now most people are going to approach an adjustable rate mortgage as a temporary loan. Either you intend to sell the house or refinance the loan prior to that date because you don't want to have such a large amount of money subject to the ebbs and flows of the interest rates. Having said that, I still think it's good to look at what I call the two ceilings of an adjustable rate mortgage. And that is, what's the worst possible interest rate you could have at that first change date, and what's the highest rate you could have over the life of the loan. And that's addressed right here. So the interest rate I'm required to pay at that first change date will not be greater than this, and that's also the lifetime cap over the life of the loan. Now, also, I want to mention too, on this issue of the opportunity to prepay the loan, it's only on adjustable rate loans in Iowa that we see prepayment penalties. It doesn't happen very often, but particularly on adjustable rate mortgages, you want to know whether there's a prepayment penalty. All right.
Does this one have a prepayment penalty?
It does not.
Okay.
And thanks for asking that. Right there it says no prepayment penalty.
Okay.
Thanks for asking that. All right. Let's take a look now at the truth in lending. And I really like the truth in lending form because it's the truth in lending form that reminds us that when we go through this process of borrowing money, it's not enough to look just at the interest rate, as awesome as that rate is. We also want to ask the question, well, what's it costing us to be able to borrow at that rate? Okay? So sometimes you'll hear advertisements, come to us, lowest interest rates in town, or come to us, no closing cost loan. And that kind of advertisement sort of drives me nuts because they're really not giving us as consumers an accurate sense of the cost of borrowing. So you want to look at both interest rate and closing costs. And the federal government is sort of helping us in this because on the Truth in Lending, they show us a number called the annual percentage rate, or APR. And what that number represents is the interest rate and the closing costs rolled together to give us a more meaningful number to compare loan to loan. The other number I like to unpack is the finance charge. And I particularly do this with first-time home buyers. So this number represents, if you were to make your payments on schedule for the next 30 years, you're paying this to borrow this. Now you might look at that number and say, Tim, that's a lot of money. I don't want to pay all that. Well, there are two ways of looking at the obligation you're taking on today. One approach is to be more aggressive at paying off this loan. And here's a fun rule of thumb. If you make one extra payment of principal and interest per year over the life of this loan, you'll cut over 5 years off the life of this transaction. I think that's amazing. But there's another way of looking at this transaction. If you were to put your money in other places giving you a better bang for your buck, higher interest debt or investments giving you a better rate of return, you may be better. It may be better for you to put your money in other places rather than on this loan. So a lot of people say, okay, Tim, I get it. There are two ways of looking at this loan. How should I view it? And my answer is always, I don't know. That depends on your financial situation. But I think it's helpful when you go to buy your first house to think about the two ways of looking at the obligation that you're taking on today. Any questions on that?
No.
Okay. Now, here's the adjustable rate mortgage variation. So on the Truth in Lending, Teresa, Normally, the annual percentage rate is a helpful number because it pulls interest rate and closing costs together to give us a better sense of the cost of borrowing. But with an adjustable rate mortgage, it's not as helpful here because the lender is having to make certain presumptions about what's going to happen to interest rates based on today's treasuries. We don't know what's going to happen to interest rates next week, let alone in 5 years. So when you're shopping for an adjustable rate mortgage, you want to look at interest rate plus closing costs, interest rate plus closing costs, and so on. I just don't think that the APR is as helpful in this setting. Now, let's take a look at your mortgage. The reason why any of us can borrow money at such an incredibly low rate of interest is because of the mortgage. And what a mortgage does, in essence, is it ties the loan to the property. So, worst case scenario, if a borrower defaults on the loan, the wheels fall off, it's the mortgage that a lender would foreclose, and eventually the property is sold at a sheriff's sale, and the loan is satisfied, and you lose the house. That's what a mortgage does. What you're looking at is a standard Fannie Mae mortgage form that's set up for Iowa. And a lot of what this covers is that process of mortgage foreclosure. And you'll see here that we recite your marital status. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay. So, any questions on the mortgage?
No, it's just a lot of pages there.
It's a lot of pages. And so this is a very standardized document, and feel free to take some time.
Should I be reading it?
Should you be reading that? Well, you certainly can. And I have borrowers who will want to read all the loan documents. I can tell you it's a very standardized document. If you'd like to take some time, feel free to read that as you're going through there. If you want a longer period of time to take a look at that, we want to make sure that that's available for you. My goal, Teresa, is for you to leave feeling like you understood what you signed today. And if that would give you some comfort, again, I will also tell you have a complete set of copies. If you said, Tim, I want to cross out this particular paragraph, I don't have the authority to do that. So these documents have become sort of standardized, and frankly, a lot of these protections are here to protect the buyer, but you certainly can take whatever time you'd like to take on that.
Okay, I'll sign it.
Okay. Thank you. You know where I've been. Okay. Those are the only documents I'm going to take you through.
Okay.
All right. Give Teresa thanks. Good job, Teresa. So I want to give a chance for you to debrief on some of that a little bit. For some of you, I added some language that you've never used when you go through the signing of the documents. You're like, do I have to do this? And the answer is no. There's a lot of freedom in what we go through. I want you to hear what I explained to a borrower. Questions, feedback on what you heard there. Some of you are veterans, and so you have your own way of doing this. Any feedback or thoughts on that? Yes, sir.
What about page 3 of the left?
Yeah, and I apologize, I didn't go through that in detail. I go through and I explain, this is a comparison between the good faith estimate of the closing costs, and this is what the actuals are. You can see your lender's done a very good job. And I walk them through the terms of the loan on that. So I apologize, I skipped over that today. Thanks for asking that. Okay. All right, let's go on. I have some additional pointers with respect to the execution of the documents. Sometimes you have a transaction where the numbers aren't right. Hate that. So in that setting, you just have to do a timeout and allow an opportunity to work with the lender to find out why there's a difference in those numbers. Maybe it's a difference in interest rate. Maybe it's a difference in the closing costs. Something isn't connecting, and you just need to hit the timeout and allow the parties a chance to work through that. Same thing, errors on closing documents. The main thing here, as a closing agent, what I want to do is I want to facilitate but not drive this. And so if the borrower has some concerns and the lender is in another state, I'll put them on a speakerphone and help them work through those issues. So you can play a role in helping to facilitate. Again, this isn't what they do for a living. Non-English speakers. You may have a transaction where the borrowers come and you're going to have to make a judgment call about their ability to understand the documents that they're signing. If you have a situation, I've had this come up, where one of their children come and they're going to do the translation. I have some strong reservations about this. And so you want to make sure that your loan officers understand that if they have borrowers who do not speak English, they need to make arrangements to have, in my opinion, an adult to come in and translate. I don't want to put this minor, even with the best of intentions, and sometimes they're very fluent in both languages, I don't want to put that minor in that situation where they're having to serve as a translator. Source of funds. This has been a point of frustration, and I think it's going to continue to be a point for a while. Seller carryback is a situation where the seller is in essence loaning money back to the buyer for part of their down payment. It is illegal to have seller carryback that is not shown on the settlement statement. So if the seller said, look, I'm getting $50,000 out, this borrower needs $10,000 to make this work, if that's what I got to do to make this transaction work, I'll loan them the $10,000 and they'll just pay me back afterwards. That's mortgage fraud. And so seller carryback is not permitted in the transaction. If you have a local lender that's fine with it, I don't know that I've ever seen this actually happen, maybe once. You would show that seller carryback line and have a note and mortgage to memorialize it. Right? So any seller carryback has to be on the settlement statement, but most lenders aren't going to approve this. Bogus gift letters. I've had transactions where the buyer has brought a gift letter, and it's come up in the course of the discussion that this really isn't a gift, it's just a loan from grandpa and grandma. Now, it's not your role as the closing agent to be the detective to try to bird dog whether this is a loan or a gift. But if in the course of the closing they tell you, yeah, we're borrowing this money from grandpa and grandma, but yeah, we got this gift letter. Well, now, what have they just done? They've put you on notice of a disparity regarding the source of funds for the transaction. Either it is a gift, there is donative intent, there's no expectation the money will be repaid, or it's a loan. Whether the loan is written or not written, that's still a loan. Right? And you would need to bring that to the lender's attention. The title is only one name, but supposed to be in two names. And this allows me to bring up the McNerney case. The McNerney case, I provided a copy of this case, and it turned back to page 35. And this is a very interesting case because it deals with really two situations. One is, what happens if we want to add another grantee to the deed at closing, or in my opinion, adding another piece of real estate. That doesn't happen very often, but it could. And let's take a look at what happened in McNerney. Page 35, just a couple of the key facts. On July 27, 1994, Gerald Menke agreed to sell and contract the following described real estate to Harold McNerney. Down a little bit further in the page. Upon payment of the purchase price, the deed that had been placed in escrow was delivered to Harold. Thereafter, he added to the deed, after his name as grantee, the following: Ann Thomas Kaler as joint tenants and not as tenants in common with full right of survivorship. Harold then recorded the deed and later passed away. The executor filed a petition for declaratory judgment in which he alleged all the above facts. Kaler filed an answer admitting these facts. Reading down a little further in the later paragraph, the court concluded that Harold's addition of Kaler's name as a grantee on the deed was a nullity because, number one, Harold did not sign the altered deed, and two, Harold made the alteration without the original grantor's knowledge. Turn over to page 36. Kaler contends, this is section B, Kaler contends that Iowa law permits the alteration of the grantee provision of a deed after delivery so long as either the grantee or the original grantee knew of the change. For reasons that follow, we disagree. A deed to be operative as a transfer of real estate must be delivered. And later it goes on, and there's a bunch of authorities there. When Harold received the deed from Menke out of escrow and recorded, we can presume there was sufficient delivery, and therefore an effective transfer of Menke's interest to Harold. Therefore, once title passed to Harold, Menke could no longer transfer any interest in the property of Kaler because, this is the important part to underline, because he had no such interest to convey. The only way that Harold could convey his interest to Kaler would be a conveyance recognized by the law. Therefore, the addition of Kaler's name to the grantee portion of the deed was a nullity. And so this happens at closing. Gloria is on the title. She wants to add Meathead as a grantee. And she doesn't understand why. It's all in the family for those of you who don't know. She wants to add Meathead as a grantee. By altering that executed deed, you now violate McNertney. So, what does McNertney hold? The Bear holding says that there can be no changes to a deed. But you and I know that we receive deeds all the time at closing where there may be a Scrivener's error. McNertney does not address Scrivener's errors, unfortunately. So, I have taken the position, and you need to get your own legal advice, I take the position that if it was supposed to be Lot 3, and I can tell from the purchase agreement, the title work, everything was supposed to be Lot 3, but it says Lot 4, I'm going to change, I'm going to alter that. Now, I'm still going to try to fax back that corrected deed to get the grantor to sign off on that to make sure that we had approval. But I don't think McNertney closes off the correction for Scrivener's errors. That's my particular position. So we know it doesn't allow the alteration of the parties, and I think also the property. But I think for Scrivener's errors, I think that's okay. As closing agents, we get deeds with mistakes with such frequency, you need to understand and have McNertney close at hand. Okay? All right. Borrowers who want to read all the documents. Teresa was making me a little bit nervous up there. Maybe she's going to want to read all the documents. And in somewhat of a difficult situation because you can't rip those documents out of their hands and say, I think you've had that long enough, thank you very much. That tends not to help with the tone of things. God has wired some people to want to understand everything that they sign. It's just the way they're wired. So that airline pilot or that engineer or that doctor, we're sort of glad that they're wired that way. But it makes life difficult for the closing. And so what I say in that situation, I like it when I'm notified ahead of time this is going to be one of those closings. But if I'm not, and that it sort of comes to light, they really want to read all these documents, or maybe they come from another country where there's not the regulatory protections so that there are standardized documents that they can count on. For whatever reason, if they want to read those documents, let them do it. But it doesn't have to be on your dime. And so I set them up in a conference room and say, look, take all the time you want. We'll come back later. Now, there are some outer boundaries to our time today. I've got to get this file. I have other matters. But take that time. I'm not going to pressure you. And you know what? They really appreciate that because that's just the way they're wired. And it really makes them nervous if you're suddenly shuffling documents in front of them and they don't feel comfortable with that. So some transactions, you're going to lose money. Right? It's just the way it is. You're going to have to take more time than you normally do. You buy your ticket, you take your ride. That just sort of goes with the territory sometimes as a closing agent. And also on that, again, a reminder, be kind, they are nervous. Letter G, borrowers disclose something that is inconsistent with the lender's presumptions. I love this part. Several years ago, we got to the end of a closing, and what happened here is that this couple was buying a house for her mother. Right? And because of some delays on the seller's part, the mother-in-law took early possession. So she is comfortable in her new house. We get all the way through the closing, and I come to the loan application, and I say, so, and this is a reminder that the lender is presuming that your financial status is the same as when we started, and they're changing jobs, you bought a car. He said, well, I'm an electrician, and last week I left my employment and I started my own company. Do you think that might be a problem? I said, excuse me just a moment. The important part of the story is that it's his mother-in-law in the house. Don't miss that part. I called the lender and I said, look, you got to help me out here. It's his mother-in-law and she is in the house. This is my worst nightmare. We're all done with the closing. Somehow you've got to have some kind of expedited way to go through and underwrite this loan. Isn't there a way to do that? Loan is off. And I come back into the closing room, and I feel like telling these people that their children have been kidnapped, right? And I explain, I am very, very, very sorry, but your change in economic status means this loan can't happen. Now, my wife will tell you I am very bad with nonverbal communication. But even there, I was able to read the nonverbal communication, particularly of the realtor who just saw their commission fly out the window. But there was nothing I could do. And the realtor said under her breath, can't you just look the other way on this? I mean, if you didn't know about this, they'd be in. He could have changed jobs next week, and the lender wouldn't have cared, right? You're quite right. He could have changed jobs the very next day. Lender wouldn't have cared. But in this setting, the problem is now that I do know. And I have no choice. I have to let the lender know about this change in the borrower's situation. Right? I have more stories about this. But anyway, this was a very unpleasant situation. I like to tell this war story to illustrate the lengths at which sometimes information comes out in the course of this transaction. Now, I'm not actually the bad guy. Who's the bad guy here? It's the lender, who did not explain to the borrower, you cannot have any changes in your economic status. So I'm only going to take so much heat over this. It's the credit lockdown that needs to take place. So don't go out and buy a house full of furniture. Don't go buy a new car. Those are conversations that the lender needs to have with the borrower. This transaction I described to you shouldn't have happened if there wasn't sloppy loan origination work that had taken place. The realtors also, now I think also can speak that into the situation as well. We've talked a little bit about situations with final walkthroughs, inspections that can take place. The terms of the loan were not what were promised. Sometimes a borrower is going to ask you for tax advice. Be very careful about this because they're trying to get some information. I don't tend to give tax advice in the course of a closing. Right? That's for another setting. Now we have some more pointers for you that are not in your material. I've had some transactions where there were disabled people. I've done a transaction where the people were blind. That was really interesting, and we had to sort of help them with the signatures. If you have a situation like that, really encourage people to take advantage of powers of attorney. It just adds a dimension for them as well as you, and so at least suggest that just to help facilitate. Maybe they're there, maybe that person who has attorney effect is signing, but the borrower is still there. Borrowers who don't want to have any explanation and they want to sign through as fast as possible. I've had this transaction. Tim, my car is running. Do you mind if I just sign through things and just leave really fast? And the answer is, I'm fine with going quickly through some of these documents, but for the settlement statement, the promissory note, and the truth in lending, we sort of have to do this my way. The rest of the documents, fine, we can sign through quickly. Oftentimes in those really fast transactions, that's when we miss signatures. And so sometimes I'll bring a staff person in just to be an extra set of eyes to make sure we don't miss a signature in those really rapid fire transactions. I don't like dealing with that, but sometimes that's going to happen. I've had a transaction where the borrower had absolutely no idea what he was signing. He was an older gentleman, and he got in, he was confused, he didn't understand the terms of the loan. Now, I'm not going to give someone a math test in order to do this loan. But folks, you need to use some judgment. If you're dealing with a borrower and they don't understand the terms, the basic terms of this transaction, you may need to say, you know what, this isn't working out. Because if they don't understand the fundamentals of what they're doing, they don't have the capacity to do this. And if you have questions on this, call timeout. It may be a family is trying to rush a situation. They haven't put in place the necessary protections, whether a power of attorney or a conservatorship, to allow this to happen. And so now you're being put in a position where you're going to ask someone who has no idea what they're signing to sign those documents. My friends, it's not worth it. You just need to call that closing off. Realtors who want to control the closing. I have this every once in a while, and sometimes you just need to exercise some control. I tend to give a little bit of leeway on this and let the realtor sort of feel like they've earned their commission and justified their existence in the closing. I have a little bit of leeway for this, but at some point you may need to gently remind the realtor, this is my closing. And I sort of have a way of doing things, and I'll give you an opportunity to have input, but I need to sort of do things my way. So a little gentle control is helpful sometimes. Otherwise, it can be a disaster. Now, what happens if the wheels fall off? I didn't have this in your outline. Let me give you a punch list of the considerations you need to have if the wheels fall off. Number one, is there a rate lock that people need to be paying attention to? So that's going to be the tail that wags the dog here in terms of how quickly we need to take these remedial steps. Does the rate lock expire tomorrow? Okay. If we need to extend that rate lock, who's going to pay for that extension? Is this a seller issue? They need to pay for that. Is it the buyer's issue? They need to pay for that. Is it the lender's issue? They need to pay for that. So pay attention. What is the rate lock expiration date? Number two, is the lender going to charge redraw fees? Sometimes you'll see that. I haven't lately, but sometimes you'll see a lender who wants to tack on some additional fees. Who's going to pay for that? Number three, what happens to the seller in all this? Right? Do they have a simultaneous closing that needs to be addressed? When is their next transaction going to take place? So we need to find out about that. Then we need to find out, what about possession for the buyers? They've got the wife, the 3 kids, and the 5 cats all in the U-Haul. And now this transaction is not going to happen. Can we do an early possession? If so, we need to have an early possession agreement. If not, what's going to happen to this family in the U-Haul truck? It's amazing to me, people who come to these closings. They've been up all night. They may have driven across country. My favorite was this guy a couple months ago who came to the closing, driven all through the night. He had 5 cats in the back of his car, and he created this barrier. This is not in your outline. He created this cat barrier to keep them all in the back seat. 3 minutes into his trip from Columbus, Ohio, they got out and drove all the way across the country with 5 cats all over him, right? By the time he got to my closing, I thought he was going to cry. So we need to sort of have some grace for the people that are coming to us in their current state. Preparation of the filing. We want to double check, make sure the marital status one more time. Guys, as hard as we try, sometimes we miss this. Don't tell anyone. But sometimes we miss the marital status. We've checked before, during, and now at the filing time. And sometimes even after the filings get through and we didn't show the marital status. So always be looking for that. Double checking the legal description. Filing instructions. I provided you an exhibit of what to send for the filing. And then also double check to make sure everything is recordable. Sometimes you'll be provided an affidavit, an assignment, and it's been prepared by someone in another state, and they haven't followed our recording requirements, and so it doesn't have a proper margin. So put a cover sheet on that, send it over, but make sure that you're not sending over filings that are not recordable. That's your job to double check that. Post-execution matters. Let's go on and talk about that. Again, make sure that your accounts are balancing. Money in, money out. We make a copy of the loan documents for ourselves in this transaction. And eventually, those get scanned. But I've provided you one of my famous stamps here, so you can just stamp that. Certified copy of, we do a certified copy of the mortgage for the lender. Sometimes they ask for that, sometimes they don't, but we always, as a rule, provide a certified copy of the mortgage for the lender. Release funds only upon approval of the lender. Now, this is a tricky point. Lenders vary in terms of what they require from you in order to release these funds. Some lenders will say, look, we need you to send XYZ PDQ documents once they're executed back, and then we'll give you a funding number and you can release these funds. So it sort of varies, and you want to make sure that you don't get caught in a spot where you've released funds prematurely and they haven't given you authority. This is not your money. And you can only release those funds upon approval. If you're closing for a lender you don't know, be very clear with them. What does it take from me to be able to disperse these funds? Parties who receive funds should sign for them. I've given you another stamp here. We've just started doing this not long ago, and we really like this. So if someone's coming in and picking up a check, they have to sign a document saying they're acknowledging receiving these funds. If you haven't done this yet, this is a really easy thing to do. We make a copy of the check and put this on a piece of paper and then stamp it, and that's what they sign. And so we have documentation that they walked out with these funds. This is a really good thing to do. We collect information for the 1099 filings. Through the years, we get questions from realtors, hey, you know, I'm headed back to this town. Let's not worry about the padding of that payoff. I'd be happy to take that payoff for you. Right? Some of you are shaking your heads. You've been here. I've done that. I've been burned by realtors who will then forget about it, and that payoff is sitting in their back seat. Oh, you know, Tim, was I supposed to take that payoff yesterday or today? So I'm a bit of a control freak. I don't send payoffs with anyone. So even if it's across town, we're going to be responsible for that. Well-intentioned people regardless. So it's time for some troubleshooting. Sometimes we have situations where we get this frantic call, Tim, there is a judgment that has shown up. Or Tim, there is a mortgage out there and no one knew about this bridge loan. So what we do is we stop the press, we don't release any funds, we get the payoff for that bridge loan, and then we redo our checks. Okay? Then I have a phone call with the parties and say, how come I didn't know about this bridge loan? If the marital status has been omitted from the deed or mortgage, I've given you an affidavit that is a curative document for that. And also if there's a scrivener's error in the legal description, I've given you one of those. Now, this next material on page 15 I think is quite helpful dealing with defectively released mortgages. I used to hire a college student every summer to work on tracking down corrective releases or assignments. And it has been such a wonderful gift from Title Guarantee to have this mortgage force-off program. It is fantastic. So if you have a situation where you have a defectively released mortgage that you're trying to deal with, as long as you have the payoff and proof of payment, you can make that go away. But here's the rub. What happens when you have a situation where you don't have a payment and payoff and proof of payment? So what we have done is we have to do a little detective work. And so what we do, let's say that it's a prior mortgage and we know who closed a subsequent mortgage that paid off the prior one. So the way this works, we have loan A secured by mortgage A. We can see that there was a loan B secured by mortgage B. So what we do is we reverse engineer this. Because I don't know who closed loan B to get those key documents. So we'll go on Iowa Land Records, we'll pull up mortgage B, and we'll find out who the notary is. And that notary then will be information that we can take back to the Secretary of State website, and we can do a search by that notary, and now we can find out what office they worked in. You follow me? This is cool. We've done this a lot. This is a cool takeaway you can take with you today. And so now we can contact that office. Hey, you closed loan B. Could you please send us the payoff and proof of payment that you used for paying off loan A, because we have to force off mortgage A. You with me on this? So forcing these documents off, this mortgage off, is a fantastic thing as long as you have those documents. This is a really cool practice pointer to help you do that. Now, sometimes you have situations where you can't even get that. And so you're going back to the old, accustomed way of trying to get that corrective release. Something that we found effective is we pull up the mortgage in question, and in the upper right-hand corner, oftentimes you'll see a loan number. Not all the time, but that loan number can be a very helpful data point in working with the lender in tracking down this file. It's a little practice pointer on trying to do that. And then we always scan our files. So for every closing I've done, except for the last few months, in a matter of about 2 or 3 minutes, I can pull that entire closing file up as a PDF. And you should be doing this. This is a very, very easy thing to do. It takes a little bit of time, but get yourself a high-speed scanner. They're not that expensive, and run them through and maintain a database in your office and outside the office. My office burns to the ground. That'll be a bummer, but all my closing files are off-site. And I can pull up any one of those closing files I've ever done. That's cheap insurance. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. I haven't solicited for questions for a while. Any questions here I can field? Okay. Yes, yes, ma'am. Yeah, the question is, do you have to do a post-closing search? We do a post-closing search, and let me say a word about this. And this is going to vary from lender to lender, so I don't want to communicate this as thou shalt do, but in my office, I always go back personally and double-check myself to make sure that all the title issues have been addressed before issuing that final title policy. In some offices, there's a little more flexibility, and the attorney who is examining the abstract doesn't go back and physically go back. That's something you have to decide in your own office. But we always get the final title search done, and then we double check that before we issue the policy. Thanks for asking that question. We do have final abstracting done that is sent to us post-closing. So you have to work through on you're going to do your own search. So how are you going to know if things are in order to issue that title policy? To make sure that releases have been done, make sure that the mortgage has been properly filed. How do you go about doing that in your office? So you can certainly do a rapid certificate, but still you're going to want to ultimately go back and make sure that those title issues were addressed.
Would the post-close search be kind of optional, since you're going to receive a copy of the final documents?
Yeah. Let me do this. Let me pull Matt in. Matt, can I pull you in on this? So from a title guarantee perspective, I want to be careful here I don't speak for title guarantee inappropriately, or maybe someone else too from title guarantee wants to weigh in, as far as the requirement that you folks have for having a post-closing search.
Well, we have different requirements depending on the kind of transaction, whether it's closing protection letter transaction and things like that. So I think that it's hard to generalize on it because of that, because every deal is different. But on a closing protection letter transaction, we'll leave it up to the closer to determine when it's time to issue that final certificate, how that search is done and by whom.
So this is a good point, and for the people who are watching this on video, you're not hearing any of this. So the takeaway from this is that as field issuers of title policies, we have a lot of responsibility. Make sure that you're corresponding with title guarantee to make sure that your office protocol meets their expectations. So I think that's sort of the takeaway I want to leave for title guarantee. Anything else, Matt, I should emphasize on that?
We'll be addressing part of that in our last speaker of the day.
Okay, good.
So everybody has
Yeah, good. And again, I didn't mention this. You want to have some kind of process where you're double checking to make sure that all your files, all those final policies are being issued. I want to shift gears to installment contracts. So this is where a lender is not involved. We have an installment contract. The seller is in essence financing this. A couple of practice pointers on this. You're going to have an installment contract, an escrow for deed and abstract, and the warranty deed. Do all those documents in advance. People die. They do. And so you want to have these things done in advance. Huge fan of having escrow agreements for both the deed and the abstract. Title work. There's some confusion over this. You're just as concerned about the quality of title in an installment contract setting as in a lender finance setting. I had a transaction a number of years ago where one of the senior attorneys in my county was representing the seller, and I said, look, we're doing an installment contract. I need a chance to examine the abstract. Well, now, Mr. Gartin, I don't know that's really necessary. We'll provide you with a continued abstract at the end of the process when your client's ready to pay off the contract. I said, well, no, I appreciate that, but I actually want to see the abstract in advance. Larry, you can ask me afterwards who it was. And so I examined the abstract, and lo and behold, his client was also buying on contract. And there was a prohibition for him to sell that property within a certain period of time. Now, this lawyer didn't know that. And he was very embarrassed when I sent my title opinion and explained this. And then the parties had to go back and do some renegotiations. But I like to share that story that you want to know what the condition of the title is before doing that installment contract. As a reminder, too, you want to make sure that that installment contract is recorded. It has to be recorded within 90 days of execution. Otherwise, there's a really big fine if that's not done. Remember, too, the transfer tax is not paid until the time the deed is recorded. For the longest time, this always confused me because I'm so geared on having the transfer tax paid initially. The way to remember this is transfer tax is tied to the deed. Once you sort of connect those dots, oh yeah, then it's okay. All right, let's shift gears now. I want to talk in our remaining time today about ethics. This is an important topic because ultimately I believe that all of us here want to do things the right way. And I get phone calls periodically from closers from around the state, and they'll walk me through the fact pattern. And what I hear them say is, Tim, I'm under all this pressure from the lender or the realtors. I just want to do this the right way. And one of my great frustrations through the years is when loan originators or brokers or realtors have said in not so subtle ways, Tim, if you don't close it this way, you know where I'm going, don't you? Someone else will. Well, that's affecting my bread and butter. You mean to tell me I might lose this lender if I don't look the other way and let this happen because I know that there's someone else who's going to close this transaction? That's pretty scary. They're threatening your livelihood by that little innuendo, aren't they? So, I want to talk about ethics for a bit. First of all, with respect to misrepresentations of income, assets, and debts. We have talked at length about the importance that the closing agent brings to the table of making sure that information is properly handled. So if there's something that you don't know about, obviously that's beyond your control. But again, things that come to your attention, you have a duty to notify the lender. Situations of forged or fraudulent documents. Here's an interesting data point. Iowa ranks as one of the lowest states in the country for mortgage fraud. Isn't that neat? I think that's pretty neat. The Department of Treasury keeps records, and I've given you a website down there on the bottom, page 16, keeps records on the frequency of mortgage fraud per state. So curious. And Iowa is among the lowest in the country. I think that speaks well for our people. But you still have to be vigilant to make sure, as a closing agent, that you're dealing with documents that you feel good about, you're notarizing documents appropriately. I have been asked many times to allow borrowers to predate or post-date documents. For example, the borrowers have to be out of town, but we need those documents signed today. So in essence, they would be predating those documents. Tim, what's wrong with that? Why don't you just have them sign it, they put the date, and then they call you the next day confirming that was still their intention? Can we do that? No. Documents have to be signed with the correct date. Imagine yourself in front of a judge and says to you, okay, so when was this document signed? But I see the document is dated a different date. Do you want to explain why there's a difference between the date they were actually signed and the date that was there? Do you want to have that conversation in front of a judge? I don't. And so if it's an inconvenience for people, they have to find a way around it. Use a power of attorney, whatever. But don't put me in a situation where I'm asked to post-date or predate documents. That's mortgage fraud. Occupancy fraud. We don't see a lot of this, but every once in a while I have a transaction where this comes up. The buyer is wanting to take advantage of owner-occupied financing terms for a rental property. I had a brick-and-mortar lender in Des Moines tell my client that they could buy a condo in Ankeny and sleep there one night, and that would be an owner-occupied property. No, 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 no. So occupancy fraud is another version of mortgage fraud. If the people are intending on using that property as their owner-occupied place, that's where they have to live, at least that's to be their intention. Over the life of the loan, it may change, but they have to go into it. That is their goal. So you see that every once in a while. Identification theft. You always want to get a copy of the driver's license. One of the advantages of the notary log is that I physically look at their driver's license and I fill out their driver's license information in my log. So that's a protection that exists. I provided you with some websites that I think are interesting. Particularly the mortgagefraudblog.com is a lawyer who, as a hobby, keeps track of examples of mortgage fraud across the country. And so it's really quite amazing. And if you're closing loans on a regular basis, pull this up every once in a while just to see what the weasels are doing now. Okay? So this is a good website to take a look at. A few other ethics pointers. You have a duty to supervise your staff. Now, as attorneys, you have an ethical duty to do that. So your staff, as lawyers, have the same ethical requirements as you do. So it's no excuse to have your staff do something, and because you don't know it, then it's okay, right? And I'm afraid there may be some offices out there where the staff are taking certain liberties and protecting the owner or the lawyer from not knowing how those things are being handled. That's completely inappropriate. What the staff does, they have an agency relationship that is imputed then to the attorney or to the owner. So you have a duty to supervise your staff and to train them to do things the correct way. Every transaction that we do, and I tell my staff this, is an opportunity either to build the relationships we have in the community, to do things in an ethical way, or to erode them. And if you're asked to do things in an unethical way, let me assure you, it is never worth it. We have attorneys who have been disciplined and now are in prison because they didn't follow these rules. They violated these rules of ethics. It is never worth it. It is never worth it. Let that sink deeply inside. Trust account. Make sure that you follow the rules with respect to reconciling your trust account. I have to tell a story. This is very interesting. We have a little mortgage fraud issue that's going on with my trust account right now. It's been about 2 months ago. we got a call from our lender saying that there was an effort to cash a check. And was this our check? They faxed it to us or emailed it to us, and we looked at it, and it was our account number, but it was not our check. I like them apples. So, this freaked me out. Never had this happen before. It was somebody out in Maryland. So I'm trying to track down who this weasel is. Who's trying to use my trust account? And it was like, I don't know, $800, something like that. It wasn't a huge amount, but still. Thankfully, the lender caught it in time. I didn't lose any money. So I filed a police report, started this process going down the road, and then about 2 weeks later, someone calls and says, hey, I received a check, and it's a trust account from your office. And I have never had anything to do with your office. I'm in Ohio, and should I cash this check? No. No. But I'm so glad you called me. I'm so glad you had the integrity to call me. Why did you receive this check? Well, what happened was, this is a person that got involved in one of these schemes where you can make tens of thousands of dollars per week from home. And what happens is that you are provided a check and it's made out to you. Pretty cool. And you go and deposit that check. You get to keep a part, and this other party gets to keep a part. Pretty cool deal. We've had 4 or 5 of these now. And we're getting closer to tracking down where this is coming from. And if I get in trouble with the law for assault, you'll know what happened. So what we did is we had a conversation with the bank that maintains our trust account. We said, look, is there a way to avoid this? And here's something I want you to talk with your bank who's taking care of your trust account. There are some new fraud prevention measures that are out there. And this happens to be with my bank, called Positive Pay. And what we're going to start doing is uploading the checks that we write every day up into this lender's account somehow, or some system. And then any check that is processed is run against these checks. And so they check the name, the payee, the amount, all this information in the check, they run that against the checks that we've uploaded to prevent this very thing from happening. There is a small fee that we pay, but it is next to nothing compared to the headache I have gone through the last couple months in dealing with efforts to try to take advantage of my trust account. This can happen to any of your trust accounts. I don't know how they got a hold of this check. Who knows? But it's happening. And my encouragement to you is that you have a conversation and find out, are there measures that can be taken with your trust account to protect those dollars that you are charged with protecting? We're going to be having conversations with Client Security and Title Guarantee to come up with some potential recommendations for closing operations in Iowa. This isn't going to be anything that's required, at least not for a while. But I at least want to make you aware this kind of thing is happening, and there are inexpensive steps that you can take to protect yourself in that setting. Questions on trust account? Anything else? Any other stories you want to share? Yes, sir.
Back up a little bit with the contract. I think the plan guide looks a different restrictions on contracts. Have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, the question is dealing with installment contracts. How does Dodd-Frank pertain to that? And I believe there will be some implications for installment contracts, but I don't know what those are yet. So stay tuned. They're literally writing these rules as we speak, so we don't know how all of these mechanics are going to work yet. I should also mention, because I was remiss in doing so, thanks for reminding me of this, Title Guarantee does offer a policy that you can provide in an installment contract setting. So don't forget to do that. Good. Other questions? So, I end with a story. A couple weeks ago, I met with a lady, and her husband died. And she said, you know, I've started this process. I went to the newspaper and I went to take out an obituary for my husband. I said, I'm sorry to hear that your husband died. Did everything go okay with that? And she said, well, I went in and I talked to the newspaper man about taking out this obituary, and the obituary went to take the information, and he asked her, well, what would you like to say in the obituary? She said, well, John died. The newspaper man was a bit taken aback. That's it? John died? That's all you want to say? She thought for a moment, and, you know, you're right. There is something more I can say. John died, Ford truck for sale. I hope that when the story is written for you, that it will be a story of integrity, that you handle transactions in a way that follow the rules and did a service in our community. I love the fact that Iowa has the cleanest title of any state in the country. I love the fact that I think Iowa is a great place to do residential real estate transactions. And when the story is written about you, I want there to be more said than Ford truck for sale. Thanks for your time today. I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch. It's been great to work with today. Thank you very much.